Morning, everybody. It's hard not when you're giving a shiur on Yom HaZikaron into Yom HaAtzmaut. It's hard not to talk about Inyana de Yoma. Some of the things we'll discuss today are well known, but some of them I think, I've seen some ideas that are relatively original, and sometimes you feel like you have to talk about certain things. So the narrow halachic point I want to talk about is famous, and that is why it is that the Rambam, does not count mitzvat yishuv Eretz Yisrael as a mitzvah in his Taryag mitzvos. Okay, that's kind of an interesting halachic topic, but I think around it has grown up and has developed, many important hashkafic, philosophic, even emotional ideas around living in the land of Israel. Let's start with this. One, it's obviously great to live in the land of Israel, and I'm preaching to the choir here. But what's interesting about it is, and I think about this every Yom HaAtzmaut. In America, in shuls at least, Yom HaAtzmaut exists around one topic. Do you say Hallel? Do you say Halal Sholem? Do you say it with a bracha? Do you not say it? Do you say, God forbid, do you say Tachnun on right? And the short answer to the question of, are you a Zionist, can be answered by whether you say Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut, and whether and if you say it with a bracha, etc., etc. Like, the greatness of living in Israel, or one of the great things about living in Israel, is that that's not a serious conversation that we have. Because if you're here, it means you value it. And, the whole, Rav Lichtenstein once told a story. He said that, I don't remember how long ago, but he said somebody wrote to him with many proofs that he believed that Rav Soloveitchik, the Rav, did not say Hallel with a bracha on Yom HaAtzmaut, right? And Rav Lichtenstein said, the subtext of the letter was that if you didn't say Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut, then you didn't value Yom HaAtzmaut, and you didn't really value Zionism. And he said it's nonsense. It could very well be that he didn't answer the question. It could very well be that Rav Soloveitchik didn't say Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut, but that has nothing to do with his view of the importance of the state of Israel. That might be limited by particular halachos about saying of Hallel and who can establish the saying of Hallel. And I think when you live here, Yom HaAtzmaut matters. In America, well, all you do is say Hallel or not, and then you go to work, and it's a regular day. But here, there's so much more to Yom HaAtzmaut that the question of saying Hallel it's not as serious a question. It's not as important a question. There could be a technical reason why somebody doesn't say Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut. It doesn't change the fact that he thinks Yom HaAtzmaut is a critically important day in the Jewish calendar and has significant halachic import. Yes?
What about some communities here in Eretz Yisrael who probably do not say Hallel?
I don't know. There's always people. I'm saying for the world that you and I inhabit. And I want to suggest, even before we start, that could be the exact case with respect to the Rambam. A lot of people, and it gets caught up in, the Zionist, non-Zionist discussion, but I think it's wrong and it's misplaced. I think the same exact way that there are serious Zionists and people who devote their lives to the state of Israel, who for narrow halachic reasons might not say Hallel with a bracha on Yom HaAtzmaut. I'm not saying there are such people, but there could be. I think to try to turn the question of whether the Rambam counts the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael in the Taryag mitzvahs or not, as a prism through which you could say, oh, you see, the Rambam doesn't value living in the land of Israel. I think it's misplaced. I think it's mistaken. I think there are reasons why the Rambam might have been the biggest Zionist in the world and didn't count mitzvat Yishuv Eretz Yisrael as one of the Taryag mitzvahs. Okay? All that by way of introduction. Now, let's start with a premise that really can't be denied. And that is that the land of Israel plays a significant role in Chumash. Not just Nach, but in Chumash, right? It's all over the place. It's certainly all over, Sefer Bereshis, and to a certain extent, Sefer Bereshis is the introduction to the land of Israel, and God gives it to the Avos, and he promises it to us over and over again. And to a certain extent, everything after that is our return, or our attempted return, to the land that God promised us. So it's hard to learn, forget Nach, it's hard to learn Chumash and not see Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, as central to our existence as a nation. At the same time, this historians have pointed out, but it's a fascinating point, we are the only nation in the world that grew up without a land, right? Bnei Yisrael as a nation became a nation, in Egypt, in a foreign land, and then through 40 years of wandering in the desert, right? There is no historical parallel to that we find in the world, right? You're French because you were born in France, and you're British because you were born in England, and so on and so forth. And your national identity was formed by the land in which you lived, and you raised your children, and and that was your culture, and that was what you shared. We're not like that, right? And it's true. And even as Zionists, we should acknowledge that we became the Bnei Yisrael. Yisrael was the name of Yaakov Avinu, not the land that we lived in. Okay, so it is true that we existed, and we can exist, in the absence of our land. Presumably, 2 generations after a French person doesn't live in France anymore, right? His children stop being French. But we're not like that. And we're not like that, obviously, because we're a religion and we're not just a nation. And presumably, when you think about it, one of the great gifts that God gave us was, okay, who renamed me on the screen? And that's not how, my first name is spelled. I just want to say, whoever did that, mocking me on Yom HaZikaron, but okay, I appreciate it. Okay, back inside. The gift...
They meant Benzoma.
To a certain extent, okay, Bruce, I'm muting you forever. Okay. To a certain extent, it's also the great gift that God gave us. Because, we all know this. There's no nation in the world that survived in exile for 2,000 years. Right? We remained the Jewish people from, from 100 CE to 1948 without a land, without an identity associated with a land. And so we're much bigger than just the land of Israel. Okay? But let's now get to the point. Aside from, the overall importance and theme of Eretz Yisrael and Tanakh, it also reads, there's one parsha in particular in Maseh where it reads halachically. Not just the land of Israel is really important, I'm giving it to you, but it sounds like it's an absolute commandment. Look in source number 1. Is it better if I pop it up on the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So let's see if I can do that. Excellent. Okay. So the Torah says as follows. Everybody see it? It's good?
Yes.
Okay. Just, to sort of get the perspective, we're now all massing on the river Jordan, about to cross over into the land of Israel.
Could you make it slightly larger?
Bruce, you want something?
Yeah, could you make it a little bit bigger on the screen?
Oh, you're kidding me.
This is fine.
You're dealing with senior citizens.
And Bruce in particular.
I beat him.
Okay, we good?
Too big.
All right, it's fine. Children, we're going to stop fighting right now. Okay. Daber al b'nei Yisrael v'amarta aleihem. Ki atem rovim et hayarden el Eretz Canaan. You're about to go over the Jordan into the land of Israel. V'horashtem et kol yoshvei haaretz mipnechem. V'horashtem is like the most active form of the word to inherit. You know, you're going to actively inherit, or you're going to disinherit all the people who live there. V'ibadetem et kol maskiotam ve'et kol salmei masechotam ta'abedu. You're going to destroy all of their avodah zaras. Ve'et kol bamotam tishmadum tashmidu, all the places that they worship God. And here it comes. V'horashtem et haaretz v'shavtem ba. You'll inherit the land and you'll live there. Why? Ki lachem natati et haaretz lareshet ota. God says, I want you to live there because I've given you the land. Now, the simplest reading, but not the only reading, is I think as a command. God says, you will disinherit those people and you will live there because it's the land I've given you. And then, you know, kind of in an editorial comment, the Torah continues at Pasuk Nun Hey, V'im lo torishu et yoshvei haaretz mipnechem. If you don't disinherit the people, v'haya asher totiru mehem, those who you leave behind will be lisikim be'einechem v'litzninim b'tzidechem. Literally, they will be thorns in your side. V'tzaru etchem al haaretz asher atem yoshvim ba, and they'll cause you great pain. And that which I promised to do to you, I will do to them instead. Meaning, if you don't want the land that I give you, then I will favor these other nations and not you. Now, there's really two ways to read these psukim. The first is as a command, right? God is saying to us, V'horashtem et haaretz. You must. You shall, you have to, it's an imperative, right? But we've seen psukim like this before. Instead of reading v'horashtem as an imperative, what's another way to read it?
Future tense.
Future tense, but as a promise. As a promise. We've seen this before. The machlokes about whether there's a mitzvah to do tshuva in the Torah or not revolves around the same exact question. When the Torah says, you know, you will do tshuva, is it saying you should do tshuva? It's an imperative. It's a mitzvah, or is it saying no? It's a prediction. It's a prophecy that the time will come in the future that you'll do tshuva. So here too, you could read it as v'horashtem et haaretz. You shall, you must inherit the land, or you could read it as a prophecy that the time will come that you will inherit the land and then God will be pleased. Okay? So that's really where it may be as simple as that. Two ways to read those psukim. It may be, not necessarily. Rashi in source number 2, one second, let me just read the Rashi. V'horashtem et haaretz. Rashi says, V'horashtem otam miyoshvea. Va'az v'shavtem ba. If you get rid of the inhabitants, then you'll successfully settle the land. Tuchlu lehitkayem ba. You will be able to live there. V'im lav, and if not, lo tuchlu lehitkayem ba. I think the fairest reading of Rashi is that this is not necessarily a mitzvah. It is a prediction or a prophecy where the Torah is telling us, listen, go there, get rid of all the inhabitants and live there. And if you do that, you'll be successful. But if you don't, if you leave all the people there, you won't be successful in inheriting the land. Okay, and no editorializing on that, but there's what to think about in terms of our lives now. Okay, there was a question.
Why is it written for Rashtem twice in Nun Beis and Nun Gimel?
Nun Beis, one second. In that context, V'horashtem is you should disinherit. Then in Nun Gimel, V'horashtem et haaretz, you should actually inherit. Okay, it's the same root word, but in one case, when you're horashtem other people, it means to get rid of them, and when you yourself are horashtem, it means to inherit.
Right, Ali, is there a way of applying this or learning this in other cases which way it goes? I mean, aren't there many other mitzvot that could also be promises?
Yes and no. I think, it'd be easier if I brought down examples. I think usually in the context, when it says, V'hayu litotafot, uchtavtam al mezuzot beitecha uvisharecha, right? So you could say, well, maybe what the Torah is saying is, I'm predicting that in the end you're gonna put mezuzot on your doors. But that's a very hard and a very forced reading, right? Normally we read psukim in the Torah, we read the verbs in the Torah as being imperatives. Here, it comes about slightly in a bit of a historical context. If you go back to one, first they're all standing on our vote Moab. On our vote on the banks of the Yarden, and it starts as follows. Ki atem ovrim et hayarden el Eretz Canaan. It doesn't just read as other parashas in the Torah. Do this, don't do this, right? It has kind of a storytelling context. Well, you're standing here on the banks of the Jordan, and you will go in and you'll disinherit. So I think it's much easier, although it doesn't have to be, I think it's much easier to read these psukim as something other than an imperative, as a prophecy or as a promise, than not. But let's face it, I think that's a major machlokes. And if you go to source number 3, the Ramban, you'll see the Ramban reads it as an imperative, as a mitzvah. Okay, some background, and we've talked about this before, but it's useful to review it to get the context. Right, source number 3, Hasagot HaRamban L'Sefer HaMitzvot LaRambam Shichachat HaAsin. Shichachat HaAsin means, it's a great phrase. Lishkoach is to forget. The Ramban says this is the list of mitzvos that the Rambam forgot. Right? What happened was as follows. The Rambam wrote his Sefer HaMitzvot, right, the Taryag Mitzvos. The Ramban did not write his own Sefer HaMitzvot because overwhelmingly he agreed with the Rambam. But what he did was, where he disagreed, he wrote Hasagot, which are like notes or notes or attacking notes or criticisms. And he would say, I don't think this should be a mitzvah. And he'll explain why. And what happens is, once he got rid of, I think it's 15 or 16, maybe it's 17, I could have looked it up, right? So the Ramban was short mitzvos. He didn't have 613 because he disagreed with the Rambam on whether to count a whole bunch of others. So then the Ramban wrote a list of mitzvos that he thought should be counted in the Taryag mitzvot, and he called the list mitzvot sheshachachan harav. These are mitzvos that the Rambam, quote unquote, forgot to count. Okay? And one of them, the fourth one in the Ramban's list, in source number 3, is mitzvah revi'it, shenitztavinu lareshet haaretz asher natan hakel yitbarach v'yitalel la'avotenu la'avraham liyitzchak u'liyaakov. We are commanded to inherit the land that God gave to Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. V'lo na'azva biyad zulatenu min ha'umot o lishmama. And we should not allow it to be inhabited by other people or to be desolate. Meaning, says the Ramban, the mitzvah is for us to live in the land. V'hu amaro lahem, and God said to us, and this is source number 1, V'horashtem et haaretz, v'yishavtem ba, ki lachem natati et haaretz lareshet ota, v'idnachaltem et haaretz. Okay, so you see right away that the Ramban reads the psukim in Maseh in source number 1 as an imperative, because he quotes it in the context of saying that there is a mitzvat aseh min haTorah to live in the land of Israel. Okay, now there's something really interesting that we need to notice about how the Ramban presents it. If I were the Ramban, I would say, mitzvah revi'it shenitztavinu lareshet haaretz. How do I know it? V'hu amaro lahem v'horashtem et haaretz. Why does the Ramban need the land asher natan hakel yitbarach v'yitalel la'avotenu li'Abraham li'Yitzchak u'li'Yaakov. So already here you see in the Ramban, I don't want to say that he's hedging his bets, but the Ramban is really kind of presenting two different ideas in one pasuk. One, it's a regular mitzvah, because the psukim in Maseh say that it is. But two, there's something much more going on, which is, this is the land that God promised Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. It's not just tefillin, it's not just mezuzah, it's something much more significant and much more a part of the Jewish people. Okay, the Ramban points out, v'nichpal kazeh ha'inyan, can you see where my cursor is in the fourth line? V'mekamot ha'achrim, says the Ramban, it exists in many places in the Torah. V'hare'ayah shezo mitzvah. Now, the Ramban, knowing that the Rambam doesn't count it, so he wants to bring proofs. So he says one of the big proofs that this is a mitzvah, amaru yitala binyan hameraglim, can be learned from the section in the Torah about the spies, where Moshe says to them, Alei reish ka'asher diver Hashem elokecha lecha, al tira va'al techat. He says, go up like God commanded you to, or like God commanded us to inherit the land. Okay, I don't know if that's the greatest proof. V'amru od, he has more psukim, u'vishlach Hashem etchem mikadesh barnei aleimor alu u'rishu et ha'aretz asher natati lachem v'cha'asher lo avu la'alot b'ma'amar hazeh katuv v'tamru et pi Hashem elokechem v'lo he'emantem lo v'lo shematem b'kolo. Interesting. The Ramban wants to prove not from halachic psukim in the Torah, but from the narrative of the Torah. Right? What was the big sin of the Meraglim? Well, Moshe says, God told you we have to live in the land of Israel, and now you're saying we'll never be able to inherit it. Right? You're rejecting what seems to the Ramban to be a mitzvah. And he says, Hora'ah shahaita mitzvah lo yi'ud v'havtacha. Right? The Ramban is aware of the question that we asked. He says, you therefore see in the Torah, when Moshe says to the Meraglim, you've rebelled against God by telling the people not to live in the land of Israel, Moshe says, you see in that story, the Ramban says, you see in that story that the land of Israel is not just our destiny. The land of Israel is a commandment. It's an imperative. God told us to, and therefore the Meraglim were rebelling against God. And then he has a halachic proof. He says, "V'zoi shachachamim karim ota milchemet mitzvah." Right? Why would the conquering of the land of Israel be called a milchemet mitzvah? He says, it must be because it's a mitzvah. It's also a funny proof. Okay, and then he goes on to say, "V'omer ani," it's worth reading. Ki mitzvah shachachamim mafligim ba, the mitzvah that Chazal literally exaggerate the importance of, v'hi dirat Eretz Yisrael. That's living in the land of Israel. Ad she'amru, Chazal say, shekol hayotzei mimena v'dar b'chutz la'aretz yeh be'einecha ki'oved avodah zarah. Okay, that's pretty serious, right? Chazal say, if you leave Israel to live in chutz la'aretz, it's as if you're worshiping avodah zarah. Right now, what's the theory behind that? Obviously, it's not really avodah zarah, but the answer is, I think the pshat is, you're turning your back on God. Right? God promised you or told you to live in the land of Israel, and you don't. So you're turning your back on him. And says the Ramban, there are many, many places in Chazal where they wax poetic and beautifully about the importance of living in Israel. And finally, he says, Im Kain, hi mitzvat aseh lidorot, mitchayev kol yachid mimenu. Therefore, says the Ramban, the mitzvah of living in the land of Israel is an eternal mitzvah. Even during the time of the exile. Now, why is it significant, and why does the Ramban feel the need to point out that living in the land of Israel is a forever mitzvah? So two reasons. One is because on the off chance that the Rambam didn't count the mitzvah of living in the land of Israel because it only exists during certain times, the Ramban is saying he disagrees with that. But I think more significantly, the Ramban wants us to not make the following mistake. one could say, listen, God took us out of the land of Egypt, and he commanded us to go to the land of Israel and to live there. But that was a mitzvah then. It was significant and critical that the Jewish people leave Egypt and head directly to the land of Israel. But that's not the case, in the 19th century, in the 20th century, in the 21st century. It could have just been, what's called a mitzvah l'shata, a mitzvah that existed at that time, which doesn't get counted in Taryag mitzvahs because it was only a mitzvah for that time. Meaning, for example, the Torah tells us you're not allowed to take more man than you need, and you're not allowed to collect the man on Shabbos, all of which are imperatives in the Torah, and perhaps one would think should be counted in Taryag mitzvahs, but the answer is no. They only applied in the desert. So says the Ramban, don't think that even if you say there's a mitzvah to live in the land of Israel, perhaps it only applied to the generation of the people of Israel who left Egypt. Says the Ramban, no, I see in many, many places that it's a significant value, and therefore it's a mitzvah that applies to us as well. I'll just point out, obviously, the Ramban spent, 70 of his 73 years on earth living in Spain. Okay, we can deal with that, but it didn't change the fact that he thinks that this is the din. Now, let's look. So we're clear so far. Just one second. We're clear so far, right? The psukim in the Torah seem to make clear that it's a mitzvah. However, it's possible to read those psukim either as a prophecy / promise, or to read those psukim as applying only to the generation that left Egypt. The Ramban disagrees with that, but he acknowledges that, it's a possibility. Yes, Joe?
I wanted to ask is, besides that he lived in Spain, but what is he saying that if you can't leave Eretz Yisrael, is it to say, he says both things, even when you're in Chutzah, is he saying that you can't leave Eretz Yisrael, that's Kilu Avodah Zarah, or?
Yes,
So
it's a good point. Your point is real. The Ramban says the specific thing that he has is leaving the land of Israel. Leaving the land of Israel is actually obviously much worse than never coming, because it's sort of like an active statement. But in general, the Ramban has plenty to support the view that Chazal saw it as a religious value to live in the land of Israel. Now,
Eli?
yes.
Why couldn't Ramban have mentioned, or maybe he does later, the preponderance of mitzvot that only can be done in Israel? So many around the Beit HaMikdash, the agrarian laws, the whole societal laws.
The answer is, Bruce, because that doesn't make it a mitzvah. Meaning, the way we lead our lives isn't that you have to be, it might be a value, but nobody ever said you have to own your own house so that then you could do the mitzvah of mezuzah. And nobody ever said that the house that you purchase has to have a porch, so then you could do the mitzvah of makeh, right, of putting up a guardrail around it. There are mitzvahs that are circumstantial, right? Nobody thinks that you should divorce your wife because there is such a mitzvah, right? So it happens to be that, I agree with you. You'd like to live a life where you maximize the quantum of mitzvahs that you do. But I don't think it's fair to therefore say it obviously must be a mitzvah to own a house, because then you could put up a mezuzah, right? You could say, I see it as a religious value because I want to maximize the number of mitzvahs, but I don't think it gets you to the status of it being a mitzvah. Okay?
But Eli?
Yeah?
Yeah, but just picking up on Bruce's comment, by the sheer number of mitzvot that are dependent on living in Israel, it's not a one-to-one type of ratio. There is just right. An enormous number of mitzvot.
You're right. I couldn't come up with with a better example, but I'll say this way. What it does is it shows that it's a value, right? It shows that it's an extreme value and a critical value, because obviously you want to maximize things. But I don't think it proves that it's a mitzvah. right? If you're trying to argue narrow halacha, is it part of the Taryag mitzvahs or not? So I don't think the answer is, well, so many of the other Taryag mitzvahs are contingent on this. Obviously, this has to be a mitzvah. I'll give you an example, okay? The Bahag does not, we'll come back to this also, the Bahag who wrote a Sefer Mitzvahs before the Rambam does not count as a mitzvah belief in God. Now, David, you'll say to me, you'll say, however many mitzvahs are contingent on living in the land of Israel, they're all contingent on belief in God or knowledge of God. There's not a single mitzvah that makes any sense if you don't believe in the existence of God. But the Bahag doesn't count it. Not because it's not important, not because it's not a critical value. In this case, I believe the Bahag doesn't count it because it's too important.
Right. It's like a meta mitzvah that
correct,
is like,
and we'll come to that. And therefore, I don't think that your argument is, Bruce's argument or your argument is a winning argument in terms of the narrow rules of what gets you into Taryag mitzvahs. Okay, well, we'll come back to this in a minute. Let's look at an example, because it's fascinating, that the Rambam quotes lahalacha. It's an expression of the importance of the land of Israel in the halachic world. The Gemara in Ksubos, Daf Kuf Yud Amud Beis, bizarrely, Daf Kuf Yud Amud Beis, Daf Kuf Yud in Ksubos, the end of Ksubos has like all the important Israel halachos. And they come about because of the following. Tana Rabbanan. The Brisa says as follows. There's a married couple. Hu omer la'alot, v'hi omeret shelo la'alot. Okay? They are living comfortably, maybe even more comfortably, in Scarsdale. Hope I'm not offending anybody. Okay? And he says, you know what? Let's move to Israel. And she's like, what, are you out of your mind? Says the halacha, kofin ota la'alot. He can force her to make aliyah. V'im lav teitzei below k'tuba. He can divorce her without paying her that which he committed to pay. Because it's like she's cheating on him or she's violating, halacha within the marriage. And if you think it's a sexist halacha, no. He omeret la'alot. She says, listen, I love the fact that you have a man cave and that we live in a mansion, but we have to move to Israel. V'hu omer shelo la'alot. He's like, no, are you crazy? Kofin oto la'alot. We force him to make aliyah. V'im lav yotzi v'yitein ketubah. If not, we force him to divorce her, and he has to pay the ketubah. So here you see, this is not tied to the Beit HaMikdash, it's not tied to the Midbar. The halacha seems clear that within the realm of a marriage, living in the land of Israel seems like it's a mitzvah of the type that if she won't do it, he could divorce her, and if he won't do it, she could divorce him.
Why does he seems like it sounds clear that if this could only be because it is a mitzvah?
Okay, excellent. Says Tosfos, thank you very much, Bruce, for supporting me by accident. Source number 5. Tosfos right there says, Hu omer la'alot, and Tosfos strangely, Eino noheg bizman hazeh. Right, this is like, Tosfos says, yeah, I know what it sounds like, but it must be that the Gemara is not talking bizman hazeh. Di'ika sakanat drachim. Because moving to Israel, says Tosfos, it's like pikuach nefesh, right? Not living in Israel, but in Tosfos' time, in the 1200s, the trip to Israel was risky, right? Aside from how difficult it would be to live there. So, people like to quote this Tosfos as saying, you see, it's not a mitzvah bizman hazeh. Tosfos clearly says it. The refutation of Tosfos is, listen, that might have been the case during the Crusades, but it's not the case anymore.
This was a Chaim Cohn that they said was a mistake.
1 second. That's not Reb Chaim Cohn. Show off. That's the regular sheet of Tosfos. Then, V'haya Omer Rabbeinu Chaim comes along this other Bala Tosfos named Rabbeinu Chaim, says, Da'achshav eino mitzvah ladur be'eretz Yisrael. Why not? Ki yesh kama mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz There's a lot of things. If you live in Israel, you got to keep a lot of rules. We don't know when Shemitah is. We don't know when Yovel is. We don't know how to be Mafish, Trumas, Umaisrus. Okay, it's a very, very strange Tosus that Bruce is correct. There are people who say, it was a mistranslation. There is no such Shita. Okay, but we don't have to say that. Let's come back to our point, which is the Rambam does not count mitzvot Yishuv Eretz Yisrael in the Taryag mitzvos. Maybe because he holds like Tosfos that it's not Noeg Bizman Hazeh. And in fact, in source number 6, that's what the Sefer Megillat Esther says. By way of background, the Sefer Megillat Esther was written. He's very open and honest about what his position, his purpose is. His purpose in the Sefer Megillat Esther is to defend the Rambam against the various attacks on him in terms of how he counted and how he came to his list of Taryag. So the Megillat Esther always says the Rambam was right. And here it is, the Megillat Esther Katav, Shetam HaRambam Shalom Mina'ah Mishum Sheino Noheget Bizman HaGalut. Right? Staggering Shita, the Megillat Esther says, no, the Rambam doesn't count the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael because it doesn't exist in the exile. And, if you want to jump ahead, presumably, and, we Zionists like to dismiss the Megillat Esther, but it shouldn't be so easily dismissed. And I'll tell you why. If you look at history as being, the result of God's divine plan, well then, God, in fact, did kick us out of the land of Israel. Right? So a position that says that, listen, well, God made a decision to kick us out of the land of Israel, and it must be the case that the mitzvah doesn't apply. Because if it applied, God wouldn't kick us out. Again, I think it's easy to reject that explanation, but it's out there. Okay? Says the Avnei Nezer, V'guf dvarav shamar shama. Shalom ona harambam yeshivat Eretz Yisrael mishum she'ena noheget b'zman hazeh v'lo hava mitzvah noheget l'dorot. He says, couldn't be any more insulting. Eino klum. It's nonsense. Of course there's a mitzvah b'zman hazeh. De'im kain, because if that's true, says the Avnei Nezer, lama mana trumotu ma'asrot v'chala she'eno nohagim b'zman hazeh. The Rambam counts many mitzvahs that don't apply during this time, during the exile. Trumos, Umaisus, Chala, all these other things. Chala is not a good example. He says, Vafilu b'mei Ezra lo nohagu min Torah. Of course, they didn't apply even during the time of Ezra. Va'adavar pashut shem mitzvah shenoheget limot hamashiach chashuv noheget ledorot. The best proof, I think, against the Megillah Esther, which the Avnei Nezer doesn't quote, is the Rambam counts the building of the Beit HaMikdash as one of the Taryag mitzvahs. So, of course, it's true that there could be periods of time in which a mitzvah doesn't apply, but so long as it's going to apply again, the Rambam counts, making all of the kalim for the Beit HaMikdash, as part of that mitzvah, right? So he says the Megillas Esther got it wrong, meaning the Rambam counts many mitzvot that might not apply during a certain period of time, but even if they will apply again, they're counted as one of the mitzvahs. So therefore, it can't be that the Rambam didn't count Yishuv Eretz Yisrael as a mitzvah because there's a time period in history in which it doesn't apply. That can't be. Also, we keep seeing mitzvahs in the Rambam that are related to the importance of the land of Israel and that apply during all times. Look at 7. Here's the Rambam in Hilchos Avadim, Perek Ches Halacha Tes. Strange halacha. Eved she'amar la'alod la'eretz Yisrael. A slave. Okay, you live in Scarsdale and you have a slave. Don't ask. And he says, listen, I'm happy to be your slave, but I want to do it in the land of Israel. Kofinet rabo la'alot imo. Just like the wife, you force his master to make aliyah. O yimkoroto lemishi ya'aluhu lasham, or he has to sell him to somebody who lives in Israel who's going to make aliyah. The reverse case, Ratzah ha'adon, one second. Ratzah ha'adon latzeit l'chutz la'aretz. You live in Tel Aviv and you have a slave, and now you want to move out to Spain. Eino yachol lotzi et avdo ad sheyirtzeh. And here comes the most important part. V'din zeh b'chol zman. Says the Ram, this applies all the time. Afilu bizman hazeh sheha'aretz biyad akum. Even, he says, during these times where Jews don't have sovereignty in the land of Israel, you would still have to move to Israel if your Eved wants you to move in Israel. Otherwise, you'd have to sell him. So you see that the Rambam thinks, or the Rambam holds, lahalacha, that living in the land of Israel has a halachic value, even bisman hazeh. And there are many, many other halachos in the Rambam that Rambam allows you to write a contract to purchase a home in Israel on Shabbos from a non-Jew because of the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so if we really believe, and certainly I really believe, that the Rambam thought that there was a form of a mitzvah to live in the land of Israel, why is it not counted in his Sefer HaMitzvot? So generally speaking, Rav Kook gave one of these answers. The Zionists, like to use one of two answers for the Rambam. One, source number 8. The Rambam, as we've discussed before, has 14 principles that he uses to determine whether something gets counted as a mitzvah or not. And he says, Hashosh HaRevi'i, she'ein ra'ui limnot hatzivuyim hakolelim haTorah kula. Says the Rambam, sometimes there's something which is too big to be a mitzvah, because it's not a narrow mitzvah. It's a foundation for many, many mitzvahs. So, for example, when the Torah says, what's a good example? Et chukotai tishmoru. Right? That's a statement that we have to keep the Torah. Okay, but it doesn't get counted as its own mitzvah because it's a mega statement, right? It's not a specific mitzvah. This week's parsha, Kedoshim Tihiyu. Nobody counts it as a mitzvah. Why not? Because it's a principle. It's too big to be a mitzvah. By the way, that's why I think that the Bahag doesn't count belief in God as a mitzvah, because it's not a mitzvah. It's too big to be a mitzvah. It's a foundational principle. So one answer, I think this is Rav Kook's answer, that we don't count, the Ram doesn't count the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael because it's the foundation for everything that we believe in. And therefore, in my words, it's too important to be a mitzvah. Not that it's not important enough to be a mitzvah, God forbid. It's too important to be a mitzvah because it's the foundation for everything. Okay, that's one answer. The second answer that people like to give is the Rambam in the 10th Shoresh Yud. You see where the cursor is? HaShoresh HaAsiri, she'ein ra'ui limnot ha'akdamot, asher heim l'tachlit achat min ha'tachliot. Says the Rambam, there are things that are commanded in the Torah, but they're only preparatory to the real mitzvah. So, for example, the Torah says, there's a mitzvah, or you're supposed to take fine oil. The Rambam doesn't count that as a mitzvah. Why not? Because the mitzvah is to light the menorah, right? You can't light the menorah without oil, so the Torah tells you, to make fine oil, but it doesn't get counted as a mitzvah. The Torah tells you have to bake bread. That's not a mitzvah. The mitzvah is to put the bread on the shulchan in the Beit HaMikdash. That's the mitzvah. So this other answer is that, of course, the Rambam thinks that living in the land of Israel is critical, but he doesn't count it as a mitzvah because the real mitzvah is being mafresh trumas u'maisros and keeping the rules of Shemitah and keeping the rules of Yovel and bringing Bikurim and, Meiser Sheni and all the other things. Okay, so essentially what's common between the two answers is that it's a form of course, it's a mitzvah, but for technical reasons, it doesn't get counted. Okay? I think that those are the common answers, and those are very, very strong answers. But I came across an answer from Rav Goren. Rav Goren was the Ashkenazi chief rabbi at the time that Rav Ovadia was the Sephardi chief rabbi. It's the 80s, right? It happens to be that I have one of his Sfarim by accident, and he has a fascinating idea that I want to share with you. He says as follows, okay? First of all, he says the answers that are, of course, Rav Goren believed that the Rambam thought that living in the land of Israel was a mitzvah, okay? But he thought the answers we give for the Rambam are wrong. He said, listen, if the reason why the Rambam doesn't count mitzvat yishuv Eretz Yisrael is because it's too important to be a mitzvah, well, how could the Rambam count belief in God as a mitzvah? That's got to be even more important than the land of Israel, right? And the Rambam does count it. In fact, it's mitzvah number 1 in the Taryag mitzvahs. Okay, that's his question on Rav Kook's answer and on the common answer. It can't be that the Rambam doesn't count it for technical reasons because it's too important or because it's preparatory, because the Rambam counts other mitzvahs of those types. Okay, there's plenty to discuss on that point, but I really want to get to his point. What he posits is the following, and it would have been easier if I put this on the sheet, but I didn't have a chance to, so you just have to believe me. The source for Taryag mitzvos is the Gemara at the end of Makos. On the last daf of Makos, I think it's Chaf Daled, right? Darash Rav Simloi, 613 mitzvos, Taryag mitzvos, nitnu lemoshe misinai. Okay? There are 613 mitzvos given to Moshe at Har Sinai. And the Rambam in the Perish HaMishnayos in Chulin says as follows, and the Rambam really believes this, that a mitzvah only gets counted in the Taryag mitzvos if it was given to Moshe at Har Sinai. Anything that came before Har Sinai doesn't get counted. Now you'll say to me, wait, Shabbos came before, and Bris Milah came before, and Ever Minachai came before. And the answer is the Rambam will say yes, but they were all repeated later. Okay, and the source for Bris Milah as a halachic matter is a pasuk in last week's parsha in Tazria. Ubayom hashemini yimol bisar or lato. The source is not Avraham Avinu or Yitzchak or Yaakov. Okay, it's meaningful, obviously, that the Avos did these mitzvahs. It gives it, it gives it power to us. It adds history to it. But the Rambam says, as a narrow halachic matter, that doesn't matter in terms of counting in the mitzvahs. The mitzvahs are 613 mitzvahs that were given to Moshe at Har Sinai. Suggests Rav Goren, and it's fascinating. He says it could very well be that the importance of the land of Israel is emphasized in Sefer Bereshis, right? That's where God gave us the land of Israel. It's true that there are psukim later in the Torah, and there's the Ramban source in Parshas Maseh, but Rav Goren says it could be that the real connection that we have to the land of Israel and the real mitzvah that we have to live in the land of Israel was given to us in Sefer Bereshis. And if you go back to source number 3, to the Ramban, right, we notice this. The Ramban says the mitzvah is Lareshet et haaretz. Look where my cursor is. Asher natan hakel yitbarach v'yitaleh la'avotenu la'Avraham liYitzchak u'liYaakov. It's fascinating. The Ramban says it's like he couldn't resist saying this. He doesn't say there's a mitzvah to live in the land of Israel. He says really there's a mitzvah to live in the land that God gave to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And suggests Rav Goren that there really could be two models to how we look at things that get counted as mitzvahs and how we look at things that are halachos. And that there's Taryag mitzvahs, those are given to Moshe at Har Sinai and after, when already the nation of Israel exists. But that's not to say that major values weren't given before then. They were. It's just they don't get counted in Taryag mitzvahs. And it goes back to the very famous first Rashi in the Torah, right? Like Amar Rav Yitzchak, why does the Torah start in Bereshis? Shouldn't the Torah start with HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodashim, which is the first mitzvah given to Am Yisrael? And what Rav Goren suggests, I think it's fascinating, is that, okay, there's narrow Taryag mitzvos that get counted, but then there's the explanation for why Sefer Bereshis exists at all. And that, according to the first Rashi, is Koach ma'asav higid la'amo, la'teit lahem nachlat goyim. God wanted to give us a history and a claim to the land of Israel. And all of Sefer Bereshis, to a certain extent, exists to make that point. That God gave us the land of Israel and it belongs to us. And suggests Rav Goren, yeah, the Rambam doesn't count it as a mitzvah because the source for the mitzvah is all of Sefer Bereshis. And it's not so much a mitzvah as our history or our legacy or the gift that God gave us. And so when you talk about living in the land of Israel, maybe we're better off not talking in narrow halachic terms. Is it a mitzvah? Is it not a mitzvah? And talk in, value terms. Meaning, what's the value? God gave us the land of Israel. What does it mean when we choose not to accept the gift? Right? What does it mean when your wife gives you a present and you say, listen, I don't want it? Right? That's a rejection of God's goodness. It's not a halachic matter. Sometimes we get hung up on the narrow halacha. Okay, it doesn't fit in the Taryag mitzvahs for a million reasons, but it's everything who we are. It's our legacy. It's who we are. It's who we're supposed to be. And I think that that's really, who am I? But I think that's such a great explanation for why the Rambam doesn't count it. The Rambam counts mitzvos. He doesn't count values. He doesn't count history. His Sefer HaMitzvos is not about Sefer Bereshis. It's about Parshas Yisro and on. Or it's about Parshas Bo and on. It's about the mitzvos. But of course, you see it in a million places in the Rambam. It's impossible to divorce our relationship with God from our relationship with the land of Israel. And ultimately, that's at the core of our relationship with God. He gave us the land of Israel. He gave it to Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And if we identify ourselves as being the descendants of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, then obviously, we have to want to live as much as possible in the land of Israel. Not because it's a mitzvah, but because of who we are. Okay, I want to end with, I think I once did this before with you. This is a fantastic medrash. We'll do it quickly. Source number 10. The Davar Acher. Rav Eli Weber, Lefanov. God is speaking to Moshe Rabbeinu. Ribono shel olam. Moshe says to God, Ribono shel olam. HaAtzmaut shel Yosef nichnesu la'aretz. Yosef's bones were brought from Egypt and buried in Eretz Yisrael. Va'ani einei nichnas la'aretz. And me, Moshe says, I can't go into the land of Israel. And not only that, you're not even allowing me to be buried in the land of Israel. Okay? How could that be? So God answers him, and it's harsh. He says, Mi shehoda ba'artso nikvar ba'artso. He who acknowledged the land gets buried in the land. Umi shelo hoda ba'artso eino nikvar ba'artso. I'll do it quickly. Yosef, God says, described himself as Ish Ivri when he was in Egypt. I'm from the land of Israel. Moshe, when the bnosei Yisro said, Moshe said, Gunov Gunavti me'eretz. I'm sorry, that was Yosef. Moshe says, Ish Mitzri, the daughters of Yisro say, Ish Mitzri hitzilanu miyad haroim, right? An Egyptian man saved us. And Moshe didn't correct them. So God says, Yosef, who identified with the land of Israel, he gets buried in the land of Israel. You, Moshe, who didn't identify with the land of Israel, you do not get to be buried in the land of Israel. So obviously it's harsh. We don't have time to do the whole thing. But the Admor Me'ostrivsa asks what seems like a great question. He says, but the facts were different. Meaning, Yosef really was from Israel. He grew up in Israel. And he, in fact, was stolen from Israel and taken to Egypt. But Moshe grew up in Egypt. How could God fault Moshe? In fact, he was Egyptian. Those were the facts. And he answers, and it's fantastic. He answers by saying, it's all how you see yourself. Okay? You could live in Chutz La'aretz. I'm not saying it's okay or not. You can live, but if you see yourself as belonging to the land of Israel, then you describe yourself that way. He said Yosef saw himself as belonging to the land of Israel. And here I think, again, not to cut anybody some slack and not to say anything about halacha, but there are people who live in Chutz La'aretz who know that in a different world they would live in the land of Israel. And God says that's a real value. As opposed to people who can't see, who can't understand, who don't understand why anybody would want to live in the land of Israel. So at the end of the day, it's not necessarily a narrow halacha. It's a worldview. And the people who associate with the land of Israel and people who feel connected to the land of Israel, that's a value. Okay? That's a value that there's no machlokas about. The Rambam agrees, the Ramban agrees. Whether it's counted in the Tarek Mitzvahs or not is as unimportant as whether halal is said with a bracha or without on Yom HaAtzmaut. What matters is our relationship to the land. What matters is how grateful we are to God for giving us the land. What matters is how central we see the land to our lives. Okay, there's going to be a siren in 2 minutes. Yom HaAtzmaut Sameach to everybody. Thanks so much for learning, and I guess we'll reconvene next week.